We would like to bring in Eric Mandel. He's the director of the Middle East Political Information Network, joining us, and also Oz Sultan, a counterterrorism expert and foreign affairs analyst. Eric, I'll start with you. Israel is just 26 days before elections that will take place April 9th. It has been relatively quiet lately. How do you see this escalation now?
Well, the question is this something related to the election? Did Hamas push the button here, especially because they almost directly control Palestinian Islamic Jihad, similar to Hezbollah? So they may have done this to precipitate a problem. The other possibility is Hamas wanted to do something because there is now an uproar within Gaza about the economic condition, and they want to deflect attention from that. So Hamas may have sent these missiles in there to rally the troops and to scapegoat. And so the possibility here is it could be either one of those groups. But again, Hamas and PIJ sometimes work together. The question is, how is Israel going to respond? Israel has basically not wanted to go into another war. They've even allowed Qatari money to go in there to keep things quiet. The Egyptians were just there. So what does Israel want to do? How much of a response do they want to make? Do they want this to get out of control when they're really most concerned with what's going on in the north in Syria, around the Golan with Hezbollah and that in Iran? That's their primary problem. This is almost a distraction that they don't want to have to engage in right now.
And Eric, would the presumption be that higher level officials in Hamas would likely know if in fact there was a rocket that had the potential of going not just in southern Israel, but all the way to Tel Aviv? I mean, that is something that, of course, stands out. The big question is going to be, would a lot of people know about that, or is that simply the level of the threat now that Israel faces?
Well, according to the Iranians, they said it was a Fajr 5, which is one that they have supplied to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But if you go back to 2012, Hamas has used that. So, the question here is either one could have used the missile. Certainly the highest echelons of either organization would know if something was fired at Tel Aviv, because that's a red line to cross. I mean, it's horrible to say, but the Israelis have dealt with local communities being fired upon. But when it goes to Tel Aviv, that's a real red line, and Israel wants to make a major response. But I don't think they want to turn this into the next Gaza War.
Sultan, we've seen a very rare response from Hamas in Gaza. They're saying we're checking who's responsible to firing the rockets and we'll take measures against them. This is a very rare statement coming from Hamas. For sure, they're not intended to go to war giving such a statement. But in the Middle East, neither side has to intend a war for a war to erupt.
Well, I think the challenge that we have is, we've seen some ISIS encroachment inside of the Palestinian territories over the course of the past few years. That's raised a challenge. And the fact that, the ISIS supply chains lead all the way back to Iran is something I think we need to keep in mind. With Hamas and PIJ both saying that this is not an act on either the part of themselves or any of their agents, raises the specter that there could be another player inside of the space. So I think the challenge is multifold. One, Netanyahu, with the elections coming up, has to probably deal with this with sort of an even hand. Two, there has to be some sort of arbitrage or forensic work done to kind of figure out exactly who this is, and I think it's incumbent upon Hamas to lead with that, but then also to work somewhat hand in hand with the IDF. And then third, I would say that if this is actually another actor, we have a much larger problem on our hands. The Fajr 5 is sort of a short-range missile. There are larger missiles that have made their way into that supply chain, including some North Korean missiles that could strike at the heart of Tel Aviv. The Iron Dome has, proven itself in the past, but I think this is a challenge that, we need to look at sort of head-on and understand the complexities of what's going on the ground and be a little bit more even-handed.
And given the number of players that might have been involved in Gaza, let's send it back out to Daniel Tzemach, who is in Tel Aviv. And Daniel, you've been following, of course, the usual response from Israel is pretty quick when rockets are fired from Gaza. But given the complexities in this particular case, would the normal tempo change in your estimation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Israeli Security Cabinet and the Prime Minister and Defense Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was in military headquarters in Tel Aviv hours after the rockets were launched. So we're talking about definitely some serious deliberation that's happening right now in the military headquarters. But it has to be said that in the past, the Israeli military has waited until the early hours of the morning. We could be looking at a strike in the coming hours. It's very likely that we will see some sort of response from the Israeli military. But given what one of your guest was just saying, it's important for Israel in this situation also not to necessarily allow their response to spiral things further out of control and bring about an escalation in and of itself. So we are likely to see an Israeli response, a formidable one, not Israeli response targeting only Hamas observation posts along the border, which is typically the case when we're talking about a lone rocket launch, which may have happened even in the recent weeks. We've seen Israeli military responses targeting some Hamas posts, but something more widespread, something that targets more strategic assets, whether it be naval sort of assets or underground infrastructure, tunnels within the Gaza Strip. Those are other sites that Israel has targeted in the past when there's been maybe a more drastic escalation, not an escalation like a rocket targeting Tel Aviv, as we've mentioned many times already, very unprecedented, but an escalation that relates to injuries or damage done to homes. We might be looking at a more widespread strike in the hours to come.
Eric Mandel, I want to go back to you. Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel is seen as Mr. Security in his country, but also here in the United States and all around the world. Do you think that such a security deterioration so close to elections might increase his chances of getting reelected?
Well, he's being a little bit baited because Benny Gantz said that we need to cut off Hamas's head, and there's been some strong response. Boogie Ayalon has talked about this being a very serious incident. And so will Bibi feel the pressure? Does he feel he needs to do that because the election is coming up? I think he has done actually quite a good job as Mr. Security for all his other problems that he's currently having. But I think you can trust him that he's not going to do this for political reasons. I think the response is going to be measured. As Daniel had said, I think Israel does not want this to go out of control. The last thing Israel wants to do, even though the new IDF chief of staff almost immediately after being installed went down to the Southern Command and went over war games and war plans to go in there. So they have to be prepared. But I think deep down they don't want to go there. And the last thing they want to do is destroy Hamas and end up having to take over the Gaza Strip. I think they would rather just lower the flames here and take a symbolic victory about hitting some Hamas targets.
We'll see how it plays out. Eric Mandel, Oz Sultan, Daniel Tzemach, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it.